All right, good evening and welcome everyone, both in class and those of you attending class through the internet. Tonight's class is on the planet Mercury. And
somebody wanted to know if this was class 3.
This is indeed class 3 and the planet Mercury. We've done the sun and moon, and I'm sorry we don't have the archives up yet. For those of you that have missed some of the classes, that will be there eventually. Just be patient with us. And those of you who are coming into this course mid-class, you'll have those to go back and refer to. Though each class itself is somewhat self-contained. Since we're talking about Mercury, and that includes reading, what I thought I'd mention now is 3 of the books that I recommend. You do not have to have these to attend this class, but if you want to do further studying of your own on this, for those of you at a distance, you can order these from the website or call up and order these, just not now during class. Natal Astrology 10.1. This is Delineating the Horoscope by C.C. Zane. Great book. Need I say more? Really wonderful information from one of our authors, Church of Light authors in Australia, Dennis Sutton, which is the birth chart and its psychological and environmental correspondences. I believe this goes for $13.95, and Doris Doan's How to Read Cosmodynes. What you will all realize is, in each of these classes, I am focusing in on the use of astrodynes. Cosmodynes is another term for astrodynes, and we'll be specifically working with those, and that particular book has some great vocabulary building tools in it for student and professional astrologers alike. Hopefully, all of you have gone in and downloaded your handouts. Those of you present in the classroom have them to work with. The quote for this week, which I really liked, is from the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. Knowing others is intelligent, knowing yourself is true wisdom. Tonight we're talking about knowledge and how each of us acquires knowledge and to some degree retains our knowledge. Last week we spoke about the moon, which is one of the 2 planets of mentality. There is a difference between the mentality of Mercury and the mentality of the moon. In last week's class, we spoke of the moon as being the accumulative subliminal impressions that we take in, that impact our instincts and our feelings and emotions. Mercury, which we're talking about tonight, is our rational thinking. It's cerebral thought. So there are actually 10 different intelligences in the chart. Each of the planets governs a different intelligence, but those which are specifically considered to represent the mind or the mentality in astrology are the moon and Mercury. So there's an image of the planet Mercury, which is the closest planet to the sun. Because of its proximity to the sun, Mercury can only be observed for a brief period during morning and evening twilight. And in this last year, we've had some exciting opportunities to view Mercury here in New Mexico, where the skies have been really clear. Now, it takes Mercury 88 days to orbit the sun and make a cycle of the Zodiac. Because Mercury enters retrograde motion 3 times a year, he spends anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks in each sign of the Zodiac. He is never more than 28.3 degrees away from the sun, and therefore can only form the conjunction, parallel, and semi-sextile aspects to this luminary. The earliest recorded observations date to the 14th century, where Assyrian cuneiform text, Mercury is referred to as the jumping planet, no doubt due to his eccentric orbit. He was also called Nabu, the messenger of the gods. Before the 4th century BC, the ancient Greeks regarded Mercury as two planets. Seen at sunset as Mercury, he was known as Hermes, and at sunrise, he was called Apollo. In mythology, to the ancient Egyptians, Mercury was known as Thoth, the god of writing. It was Mercury/Thoth who helped Isis work the ritual to bring Osiris back from the dead. And Thoth was always pictured with the ibis head, and here you see him holding both staff and the ankh, the symbol of life. Now, in the Greek tradition, Hermes was the son from the union of the god Zeus and Maya. And in this image, you can see many of the attributes of Mercury. The cock or rooster in the lower corner. He holds both a paint palette and brushes. He's crowned with his winged helmet. Oftentimes he's pictured with winged sandals as well.
What's the cock?
It's the bird that was considered sacred to Mercury, and I know there's a story in mythology that I'm not remembering at the moment, but it's also the bird that heralds the dawn, just as Mercury can be seen rising before the sun in the morning.
Yeah. Okay.
He was the god of weights and measures, commerce and cunning, boundaries, travelers, wit, literature, oratory, and poetry. Our words merchant, merchandise, and mercenary all have their origins in Mercury, the Roman god of trade. One of the other animals of Mercury not pictured there, one of his symbols is also the tortoise. And the reason for that is Mercury, when he was born, he was very precocious, immediately up, walking and talking. And the first thing he did is he exited his cave and encountered a tortoise at the entrance to the cave, which he immediately killed, and obviously not the god of ecology. Back then they probably weren't endangered species. And he turned the carapace of the tortoise into the soundboard for a lyra. And he later traded that off to Apollo. So Apollo is oftentimes seen playing the tortoiseshell lyre, which he received, or harp would be another word for that, which he received from Mercury. In cunning, his second, act as a child was to steal a herd of cattle from Apollo. And he did so by getting the cattle to walk backwards. So Apollo was confounded as to where they could have disappeared to, and he fashioned himself shoes out of twigs and walked backwards as well, and stole the cattle that way. So Mercury is, at least to the Romans, was also considered to be the god of thieves.
Is that a retrograde Mercury?
I guess that is truly, that is retrograde Mercury. Very good, good day. Wet is also ruled by Mercury, so. So here's another image of Mercury. And you can see the rooster here again. I'm not quite sure why the goat is pictured in this image. But he is holding a staff, which is very familiar to us. And we'll see it in different places. We'll talk about it shortly. Somehow, this staff got confused by American doctors with the rod of Asclepius, the great healer of classical mythology, whereas the rod of Mercury is actually the rod of merchants. Some have told me they feel that actually represents our medical system.
What's the, is that cornucopia that he's holding on the head of the...
I'm not sure whether it's a lovely cap, or it could be a cornucopia,
yeah.
Which is usually associated with, well, actually with Zeus or Jupiter.
Okay.
Because he was actually, Jupiter had to hide, but we'll talk about that in 2 weeks. We'll talk about the cornucopia. I'm not sure of everything in this illustration, or why it's there.
Yeah.
And here I'm repeating myself. What about when we call someone mercurial? What are we indicating?
Quick-minded?
Quick-minded, or they change a lot. A mercurial person is somebody who fluctuates and vacillates, and we can see that both in the metal Mercury as well as in the movement of the planet, as it is quite erratic. All right, Mercury's winged hat was the symbol of his ability to freely fly. Say 10 times fast. Freely fly. Between the realm of the mortals and the immortals. In astrology, Mercury is often considered as a mediator or intermediary between two parties. In Roman times, it was the caducator who negotiated peace treaties. And that word, caducator, comes from the caduceus, or the rod, which he holds. Two serpents. I think of it as sort of the DNA double helix going on here, but it's the two serpents that are wound around, oftentimes, a winged rod. All right, continuing along the mythological line, in Hindu astrology, Mercury is known as Buddha, and is the god also of merchandise, merchants, mathematics, and science. Yesterday was Wednesday, or Woden's Day. And Wednesday, or Woden's Day, comes to us from the Norse equivalent of Mercury, Woden. Now, in Latinate languages, the names for Wednesday all stem, except with the exception of Portuguese, they all stem from Dies Mercury, or Mercury's Day. So in Spanish, it's miércoles, in Italian, mercoledì, and in French, mercredi. It's only in Portuguese where it's quarta-feira, or the fourth day of the week. All right, this is a quote from Ancient Masonry, where C.C. Zane talks about the symbolism of Mercury. Mercury is symbolized by the crescent of the soul surmounting the circle of spirit, and this surmounting the cross of matter. This indicates that the soul and spirit have triumphed over sensation. It conveys the thought that wisdom has been garnered in both physical and superphysical realms, and that this has resulted in an equilibrium between the practical and the ideal, that the aspirations have been realized through the union of inspiration and concrete experience. So here again, we're getting the sense of Mercury as being this mediator between two realms. In Greek mythology, Mercury was known as a psychopomp, or a leader of souls. And he was one of the few individuals that could pass freely between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead. We know, of course, only Pluto or Hades was able to do that, and certain individuals were successful in doing that, primarily Persephone, who would spend half of the year underground and the other half above ground in the world. But generally speaking, once you went into the underworld, you never got out. But Mercury would lead the souls into Pluto's realm. So here again, it's an interesting concept of this ability to move between physical and supraphysical.
So is Mercury only a one-way? Does he only do it one way? Doesn't lead from death or afterlife back to life?
Generally not. Generally it is one way that I know of. I'd have to scour mythology to see if he ever led a soul out. Usually it is a one-way ticket.
It's always to Hades.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Or possibly to the Islands of the Blessed, or some other, the Elysian Fields, one of the many, spots in that other world. Mercury, from the astrological perspective, affects our studies, mental interest, increases our writing and intellectual activity. It has an impact over our accuracy in calculations, memory, and attracts opportunities for communication and self-expression. Chances are, if you have problems in any of those areas, you might have an afflicted Mercury. Or there are periods in our lives where we have temporary problems in those areas. Certainly the period of Mercury retrograde is quite often touted by astrologers. Now, where Mercury falls in your chart, we say that area of the chart is subject to thought. You can see at the top of this page, Mercury corresponds to the intellectual urges of the soul. Now, the most positive expressions of Mercury are considered to be through expression itself. A dominant Mercury person, you never want to tell to shut up. Because they identify themselves with their ideas, with their thoughts. And that is just a way of shutting them down completely. The negative trait associated with Mercury, again, erratic orbit, frequently goes retrograde. Restlessness or nervousness are considered to be negative traits. We've all at some time been around persons that were so wound up, what I call having their engine running, where they could just be, their foot's tapping or they're twitching away somehow, and that's oftentimes represents a Mercury affliction. Now, Mercury among the planets is neutral. He is not conditioned with any innate harmony or discord. This means that he receives his conditioning either through relationships with the sign in which he falls, what we call essential dignities that we'll talk about later tonight, or through aspects. There are harmonious, discordant, neutral aspects. Aspects from Mars and Saturn add discord to Mercury in a chart, and aspects from Venus and Jupiter add harmony to Mercury. Here's another quote out of the Beginner's Horoscope Maker and Reader, where Albert Benjamin says, "The electrical currents which carry messages over the nerves and all cerebral processes, including perception and comparison, are ruled by Mercury, and all expression of thought in speech and writing are expressions of thought cells mapped by Mercury." He goes on to say, "These thought cells, which so powerfully influence the intellectual ability, the intellectual interest, and the habitual methods of objective thinking, have been organized in lower forms of life through learning to remember and recognize enemies, palatable foods, and suitable localities for shelter. Because their chief expression relates to the intellectual life, they are called the intellectual thought cells. Aspects to Mercury affect the mental interest, the faculty, the facility and accuracy of expression, and the type of cerebral activity. To the extent the thought cells mapped by Mercury are active, is in the life, excuse me for stumbling here, but this is
I think it's an N.
okay.
Alright.
Active in the life, influenced by thoughts about time, written or verbal expressions, calculation, travel, the recognition of size, weight, form, and color, or the solution of perplexities." Any of you have opportunity to do that?
The solution of perplexity. One just the other day.
Yes. I have perplexities, few solutions.
With the nervous system, they're talking about all the parts of the nervous system.
Yes, all of it is governed by Mercury. In the body, we consider the brain to be ruled by Mercury, and the nervous system, both sympathetic and parasympathetic. Basically, Mercury was the messenger of the gods, and it's our nervous system by which we send messages from the brains to all of our organs to move and function, and vice versa. All of our senses send their reports back to the brain through the nervous system. And the tongue is considered to be ruled by Mercury as well.
So cerebrospinal fluid, would that be part of it?
Yes, though considering fluid is involved, one might look for aspects between Mercury and the Moon, if one's looking at that. I mean, I must tell you, medical astrology, you almost have to have a medical degree to practice medical astrology, because you have to know what you're talking about. And we have one member who's really brilliant in that area, Paul Bergner. But most of the rest of us just stab around specifically with the organs and the zones of the body in terms of what we're looking at. And what I find is when you read stellar healing and or the cyclopedias, the Church of Light cyclopedias, the diseases that were prevalent in Zane's day are not all the diseases that are still prevalent today. We have, nowadays we're looking at things like Epstein-Barr, fibromyalgia, HIV, other things that just weren't even known or diagnosed back then. And then other things such as dropsy and, water on the knee and there's still pleurisy and things like that, but these are things that are sort of less common in today's roster of illnesses. All right, thought cell. The metal of Mercury corresponds by the same name. We either know it as quicksilver or as the metal mercury, and it is unique among the metals. In normal temperatures, it's actually found in liquid state. However, mercury can take on both gaseous and solid states. If you drop it to sub-freezing temperatures, you can make a hammer out of it. And if you heat it up, it becomes highly toxic in a gaseous state. The gemstone would be cinnabar, which is the mineral from which mercury is extracted. And the Chinese do a lot of carving and beautiful lacquerware with cinnabar. The astral tones associated with mercury are the color violet, the musical tone B. There you have it. The brain is the physical part of the body. And we discussed already the fact that the nervous system. This isn't working. Oh, probably because I'm pushing the wrong button.
How did they come up? How did he come up with the musical tones that were associated and the colours that were associated?
I'm not sure, to tell you the truth, how they were derived. Basically, what we know is the musical scale, by some, there are other scales, there are pentatonic scales and other types of scales out there, but the main scale in the Western system is an octave based on 7 tones, and then the 8th tone being the higher expression of the first, the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do again. So, to tell you the truth, I'm not sure if he sat there with tuning forks and decided C was Mars and B was Mercury. There's no writing. I don't know if he's drawing from an older writer in the field, from Paracelsus or someone else. And again, with the tone, the rays, the colors really make sense to me in the Zane system, but there are other astrological systems out there that might assign something like, I don't know, blue to Venus or some other thing. So it's hard to say. I think it's based on the frequency of light and or the emotions that the color stimulates being most similar to the nature of the planet. But I couldn't say for certain, and I think because these things they have different rulerships in other systems, you have to take it somewhat with a grain of salt and work with it and see which works for you. So, where do we develop these intellectual urges? In the earlier quote from Zane, he talked about this perception actually being developed in earlier life forms. Anyone recognize that plant?
Mimosa?
Mimosa, very good, Barb. If I had gold stars, I'd pass one to you. It's a mimosa, which is also known as a sensitive plant. And if you brush up against that, the leaves will recoil from you. Has anyone ever spent any time with an apiarist? Bees have this amazing way of returning to their hives, finding their way home. We know that birds are able to do that well. I always am amazed going down here to the Bosque del Apache in winter and seeing all the migratory birds that somehow know that they have a winter home in one place and a summer home in another location. One of the most amazing insect populations are the monarchs, which fly something like 2,000 miles from, like other Canadians, they like to go to Mexico in the winter, and we all understand why. And they go down to this one area in the state of Michoacan, and I'm forgetting the name of the park right now, but there is a butterfly refuge, basically. And out on the savannah, animals have to remember their feeding grounds and their water holes, oftentimes traveling great distances during courses of the year in search of food and water. The other thing they must do is animals have to communicate to one another the presence of danger. So certain deer will lift up the white side of their tail to draw attention when danger is present. Other animals use certain calls or sounds as a way of communicating this to others within their group. Yes, Barb?
Elk and pronghorn flash the white hairs on their butts. And it's like semaphores. It just catches your eye. It's so bright.
Good to know.
And
One ever sees their butt flashing, I'll have an idea of what's going on. I'm having some trouble moving these slides. All right, here's another quote from Zane, which relates to this. Birds and mammals recognize the call of distress, the danger signal, and the food supply call, and the mating song or noise. This is language in elemental form, and along with perception of qualities such as expression, aids in realizing various desires. In human life, these intellectual thought elements have thus been built into the astral body and mapped by Mercury in the birth chart. They are the source of eventuality, language, calculation, and the recognition of size, weight, form, and color. It goes on to say, thinking, which is studious, or expression, which is ill-considered, is responsible for the fortune or misfortunes that come through intellectual cleverness or its lack. Writers, lawyers, and teachers who are successful have these thought elements prominent. Discordant thoughts of this type, in which there is grinding concentration on some problem, is chiefly responsible for nervousness, neuralgia, neuritis, sciatica, hay fever, asthma, and some bowel complaints. Together with thinking about domestic conditions, they lead to mental diseases. Scary. That can be found in Mental Alchemy.
I'm curious about, together with thinking about domestic conditions, that caught my eye.
Mm-hmm. That's Mercury. Domesticity is the expression of the moon. And when you combine moon type thinking in a distressed way with Mercury thinking, then you got problems. And that's oftentimes found in a chart, at least what are considered to be constants for mental illness, are things such as, not to scare any of you out there that have these aspects, but Mercury-Moon oppositions, squares. The semi-square and sesqui-square are usually not enough to make you mad, but they do make for periods of grinding, concentration, and obsessing, and the inability to free oneself at times from certain trends of thinking. When you add the moon to Mercury, what happens is you bring in the emotional element, which makes it harder to shake off than when you're just rationally thinking about a problem.
Could that be like, could obsessive compulsive disorder come under Mercury? Or
I think of it more as a Pluto-Mercury combination. But I would say it is a factor because it has to do with our where we hold our thinking. but I think the Pluto adds the compulsive component to that. Now, in delineating the horoscope, one of the books I presented earlier, Jane says, the Mercury person is an excellent agent. Best where he can attain his ends by writing, talking, or travel. His best quality is expression, his worst quality, restlessness. Clerical work of all kinds appeals to him, as does accountancy. He is decidedly clever and learns a new task with great facility. He should learn, however, from the fable of the tortoise and the hare, that the race is not always to the swift. Also, that the highest form of expression of his mentality can only be attained through protracted concentration. The thought ruled by this planet are called intellectual thoughts. All right, and one more quote, which is from Horary Astrology. It gives the physical characteristics of Mercury as being lean, nervous, sharp features, small eyes and ears, hair brown. Where this is useful is in Horary Astrology, if you're trying to locate a person, or in natal astrology, this can lend some description if it's a planet in the first house or a planet conjuncting the ascendant, or the planet that rules the first house. It helps us define a physical description. Of course, the thing that is most powerful in physical descriptions are, of course, one's DNA and ethnic background. I mean, you can only have, brown hair, small eyes, and ears if that is also a pattern within your heredity.
Could it be a relative thing, though?
It is relative to, I hate to use the word racial, because there actually is only one race, but it is relative to your ethnicity. So, let's look at the way in which Mercury expresses. We're keeping in mind each one of us has all 10 planets within us in varying degrees of strength. What we've been doing in these classes for the last 3 weeks is choosing a chart that so well represents someone of that planetary temperament and seeing how these qualities express. But we have to keep in mind that we have all of this inside of each one of us. So harmoniously, you think of Mercury as opportunities to express your intelligence, being perceptive, constructive communications, the ability to be reflective. Think of the metal Mercury. It's used to line mirrors. It's oftentimes used for the mirrors in really large telescopes as well. They use a pool of Mercury to reflect. It is analytical, evaluating. Mercury exercises logic and reasoning. All of us do this some days, sometimes. And then we also have discordant Mercury, which is when we are expressing as being critical, when we might have poor communication skills. That's usually accompanied by the statement, I haven't a clue what you're saying. Errors in calculation. Anyone done that? Nervousness, anxiety, neuroses, mental ruminations, and or, my personal favorite, forgetfulness, are all aspects of a discordant Mercury. So, these are your vocabulary builders. You have them in your handouts. They're on the screen. I'm going to go through them. They're in alphabetical order as opposed to being in order of conceptual order. But traits, positive traits of Mercury are being agile, alert, articulate, astute, attentive, chatty, clever, coherent, communicative, conscientious, curious, erudite, expressive, focused, informative, ingenious, inquisitive, intelligent, judicious, knowledgeable, logical, lucid, mental, nimble, observant, perceptive, rational, reasonable, scholarly, shrewd, smart, talkative, thoughtful, verbal, vigilant, wise, and witty. Those are all positive Mercury traits. And you can take this list and sit down any day with a thesaurus and find even more traits to expand your vocabulary. And the negative traits of Mercury are when we are anxious, apprehensive, calculating, canny, crafty, cunning, deceptive, devious, discontented, edgy, fanatical, fidgety, high-strung, interfering, intrusive, jumpy, long-winded, loquacious, there's a great word, meddlesome, nervous, nosy, overwrought, preoccupied, prying, rambling, restless, scheming, sly, a snitch, someone that's snoopy, stressed, tense, verbose, and wily. Those are all negative traits of Mercury. Now, take this concept into occupations. What type of people would represent a Mercury force? And these could be accountants, agents, analysts, announcers, bookkeepers, broadcast journalists, brokers, chauffeurs, columnist, communicator, commentator, courier, critic, diplomat, dispatcher, driver, file clerk, instructor, interpreter, librarian, linguist, mediator, messenger, negotiator, news anchor, postal worker, programmer, representative, secretary, stenographer, teacher, telephone operator, tutor, writer. Do you see a theme in all of these?
Yeah.
Yes, Vicki.
On the negative traits that we just previously looked at, Snoop, I never thought of Mercury as being snoopy or whatever, snoopy and nosy. That's interesting.
Mercury wants to know your business.
Okay. Is that
I
why
mean, the
being a
moon
reporter?
is also a quality we might associate with the moon. We talked about over dinner the value of gossip.
Right.
But yeah, like a reporter, an
Like
investigative reporter.
Okay.
If you're persons with dominant Mercury, they won't stop asking questions. Yeah. It feels more like you're being interrogated. Yes.
Yeah, Paul is like that.
The world knows.
Trying to get the information.
Oh, that's all right. There was just a function. Oh, what about an investigator? Was that something?
Well, yes, I think to some degree that would bring in the
Isn't that more 12th house though?
But yes, I mean, again, what you have to keep in mind with astrology, there are overlaps. There are overlaps between planets and signs. There are overlaps between signs and houses. So again, as Vicki pointed out, the 12th house oftentimes represents someone that may be a researcher or an investigator or a private eye or a detective, psychologist, psychiatrist, anybody who's really snooping into your innermost secrets.
That's the kind of delving kind.
It's delving. Yeah.
Right.
There's another good vocabulary word. Not for Mercury, but for the 12th house.
Yeah.
Delving.
I'll put that as my job description on my profession.
I'm a
I
delve.
Now, what I want to do, we did that. Let's talk about dominant Mercury personality. What adds power in a chart can be house position and aspects. Generally speaking, and in some of the future charts we look at, the dominant planet may not be found in an angular house. But here, with this chart, Mercury's at 23 Libra, 21 minutes in the first house. The Astrodites, is that correct? No. Sadly, they're not sorted by, according to power here, they're in their natural order. So, forgive me for that. I will next week try and get this sorted according to power. But you can see down here, this is the highest number. Would everyone agree?
72, or what, 70, whatever that is. 70.
Yeah, whatever that is.
It's a
I don't
little
know
blurry.
what eyesight.
It's hard to see, Christopher. I think it's just kind of blurry.
Okay.
Oh,
You do have your own copy.
Yeah, 72.
Thank you. I think, did I just lose the microphone?
It's good for Mercury, isn't it?
Yeah, this would qualify as a distorted Mercury.
That doesn't fix a system.
I'm dragging the microphone along the floor here
Do you need help?
in a bad way. I need so much help that someone would end up having to charge me for it. All right. So if you actually look at your handouts, this should be the final sheet. I've placed the chart, yes, page 13. Or no, that's my page. I have a different handout than yes, page 9. You can see Mercury has 14.1% of the power in this chart. That's pretty enormous. That power, if you go over to the right-hand column, 15.72, harmonize. So it actually looks like it is the second most harmonious planet. Only Jupiter is more harmonious than Mercury in this chart. So just with this little amount of information, how might you describe someone with Mercury and Libra in the first house?
Well, they want to be an aggressive interrogator. No.
Only, well, that would include Mars. If you're using aggressive,
right.
then we have to bring in the Mars element.
But
Mercury and
being in
Libra
Libra
would not be an aggressive
Right. It would be
interrogator.
About peacemaking or mediating or...
Right. Wanting to come across as being pleasant, polite, easygoing. You wouldn't think of them as hard-hitting. Though Mars is here, but what sign is Mars in?
It's in Libra.
Also in Libra. So what happens to Mars in Libra?
Well, it gets modified.
Modified into being more pleasant or agreeable or polite or expressing along some lines of social skills.
So
you can find out a lot of things in a very nice way. You get all
They
the
could
information.
insult you and you would think it was a compliment.
So that'd be like a really good diplomat, this person.
I would say that that would give diplomatic skill. And there's other factors. Look at the sun, sitting right on the ascendant.
Some big sorrows.
Here is the sun on the ascendant, and Mercury is here, 23 Libra 21. Is that the drawing that was requested? Great. So, big sorrows, you said?
Well, the sun in the 12th house. You'd think there would be some big secret sorrows.
But in Libra, then at least be well-dressed sorrows.
Yeah. Well, right. They would. Before you took them out in public, you dressed them up really well.
So let's look at what is it that contributes to making Mercury so powerful in the chart. In addition to the first house placement, we would expect there to be a lot of aspects to Mercury. Here is the most powerful aspect to Mercury, which is the conjunction of Mercury and Mars, which we've already talked about. You have the aggressive urges in a prominence compound with the intellectual urges. Look at the power of that. We also have here Mercury involved in a trine, or a luck compound, with the domestic urges. Now, we spoke earlier that if you have squares or oppositions between these planets, watch out. I think the clinical term is nuts. But what about a trine between the domestic urges and the intellectual urges? If you think of both planets as governing mentality, the domestic urges, 23, Gemini 31. We have the intellectual urges at 23, Libra 21. That's a nice, powerful aspect.
There would be a lot of fluidity. The communication would be fluid. Your thinking would be fluid. It would come easily.
And they're in air signs, intellectual signs, which adds to that. So fluidity is a great word. Someone would say this is someone who can think on her feet.
Yeah.
And the moon is in the house of public expression. So in terms of publishing, broadcasting, publicly expressed opinions, that there would be a great ease there between the personality and between self-expression. Here's another very powerful aspect, which oftentimes would go unnoticed, but it is a parallel aspect of Venus to Mercury. This is an intensity compound formed by the intellectual urges and the social urges. How might that express? I'd say this is somebody who could be quite, even though the sun in the 12th house does indicate a sense of privacy or shyness, there are other factors that can indicate a gregariousness. Venus is in the house of friendships, so this is someone who might be able to easily navigate through social circles, groups, clubs, persons of, cultural interest and the like. Also, again, when Mercury and Venus are aspected like that, it makes for a very creative mind. One is always thinking about things or interpreting life either through its aesthetic qualities or its social qualities. Looking at life through relationships. Let's talk about a specific aspect tonight too. Each week I'm trying to focus on one aspect. So by the end of 10 weeks we will have also not only covered the planets, but we have also covered the aspects. And there's actually a hidden relationship to some degree between each aspect I describe and the planet of the night. So the flavor of the day. The semi-square is a friction compound, formed when two planets are 45 degrees or 1.5 signs apart. This is a mildly discordant aspect which manifests as uncertainty and vacillation. Does that have anything in common with Mercury? Mm-hmm. Rather than cataclysmic disruptions, a progressed semi-square causes anxiety, hesitation, worry, criticism, and many reoccurring abrasions. Have any of you ever been abraded?
Yes.
Think of a salt rub or The discord it attracts is usually due to the cumulative effort of the little discords in the environment. Under a semi-square aspect, we must effort to maintain a positive attitude. I know we're going to have to break shortly to change out the film. So, any thoughts on semi-squares? They're not powerful. They are the little irritations in life. But guess what? Little things can add up. We call it the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Have you ever seen any aspects that could indicate something like post-traumatic stress disorder? I mean, this wouldn't be big enough, but it looks like how it works is related to some of the activities of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah, it would be good to have accurately timed births for 100 patients with PTSD, and to be able to look to see if there are constants between charts. Seeing the role of Mercury, seeing the role of the moon, and also looking to see if there's any other factors in there that might stand out that we don't expect. Time to break?
Nothing.
No. Okay, you let me know.
Close.
All right, back to our dominant Mercury personality. Does anyone recognize her?
Oh,
Barbara Walt.
oh my goodness.
Barbara Walters.
Yeah, she really does have that gift.
Yeah, if we think of the chart, here you have it. American broadcast journalist and author. She's hosted Today, The View, 2020, ABC Evening News, World News. She wrote How to Talk to Practically Anyone About Practically Anything. That sounds like a Mercury Moon trine in air signs, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That would cover all the bases.
Yeah.
And again, going back to this Mercury-Mars aspect, oftentimes she was criticized for not being hard-hitting enough, because she quite frequently maintained politeness with most of her guests. I think the most watched interview in television journalistic history was her interview with Monica Lewinsky.
She has a way of, you know, what's the word? Not keeping people unguarded. You know what I mean?
They get
They get comfortable, and then things just come out. And
Yeah.
Yeah, she lulls them into a comfort level with her, and then
Yeah.
she'll slam them with the hard questions.
But you cannot be as successful as she is without being somewhat aggressive.
Right, and that Mars is in the first house, especially if you consider when she started doing this back in the 50s.
Yeah, she was a first woman, wasn't she, that performed any of the roles that she's played?
Yeah, certainly one of the first. So she was definitely a trailblazer in that sense. And again, Mars is in a cardinal sign, a pioneering sign.
But and also when she started out, she was known for her. She had kind of a speech impediment.
She has a lisp.
A lisp, right?
It mostly has to do, I think, with L's and R's, which is, if you think of Mars and Mercury in the first house, she was actually made fun of. If any of you remember from the 70s, Gilda Radner on Saturday Night Live. I'm having an afflicted Mercury tonight, stumbling over my tongue. She performed a skit called Baba Wawa.
Right.
Because of the way in which she rounded her R's, which I think is something that's part of the Boston language tradition. She was born in Boston, I believe, and raised in New York. So it's sort of an East Coast thing, but with her It is outstanding. And so much so that she was mimicked for it in the Comedy Channel. So, here are the aspects to Mercury. They fall along this line where we see Mercury forms an aspect to many things in the chart. It forms a trine to the moon, and it forms a sextile and parallel to Venus. Mercury conjuncts Mars, forms a trine to Jupiter, sextile to Saturn, and a square to Pluto. And the square to Pluto, I think, is the, I think she was originally really upset by the fact that she was being imitated in a comedy show. And I think it was her daughter that told her to, lighten up, Mom. So she was able to get over herself. All right. Change. All right, we're talking about aspects.
Is this a good time to change the tape?
Yeah, perfect time.
Okay, we're going to take a brief break to shift out the tape. We've not gone off the air. Stay tuned. Very good. Some of you who have been touring with us the last couple of weeks have seen this screen before. And talking about aspects, we talk about aspects because they add energy to any chart. And what aspects are the angles between the planets in a chart. Not only add power, but they add conditioning. And over the last couple of weeks, we've discussed the neutral aspects are the conjunction, the parallel, and the inconjunct, sometimes called the quincunx. The harmonious aspects are sextile, semi-sextile, trine, and the discordant aspects are semi-square, sesqui-square, square, and opposition. In talking about the semi-square, I think I've repeated this. Well, it's come up again. I've already talked about our abrasions and the need to maintain a positive attitude. Let's look to Barbara's chart to see if there are any squares here. And we'll use this as a learning aid tonight. I don't think I was able to find more than two. And the first one that I discovered was a semi-square between Venus and Pluto. This is what it looks like in the chart. You can see that Venus is at 29 degrees Leo, 44 minutes. Pluto, 19 Cancer, 30 minutes. So, how we determine that? From 19 Cancer to 19 Leo would give us 30 degrees. And here we have another 10 degrees to 29 Leo, which brings it up to 40 degrees. So this barely...
It's weak.
It is so weak that it has only 0.23% of power in this chart. But nevertheless, since it was one of only two semi-squares I could find, we have to talk about it. Although she may rarely ever experience it because it is so very weak in the chart. We can still make stuff up. Here you have what? You've got the universal welfare urges, Pluto, in the house of career, honor, and reputation, involved in a friction compound with Venus, the social urges, in the 11th house of friends, groups, and organizations. I don't know enough about her biography to know if she's involved in any charitable groups or any professional organizations or the like. My guess, chances are with the sun in the 12th house that she's secret about those things rather than public. But nevertheless, one would guess with a semi-square between Pluto and Venus that attending those types of functions could irritate her. That it wouldn't necessarily be a fun situation. And would have to decide which planet is actually the more potent in the chart. Pluto has 8.7% of the power, Venus 7.1. So you oftentimes have to look at the stronger aspect to see, the stronger planet to see which is siphoning the energy. So my guess is Pluto in the 10th house, she might actually have aspirations towards universal welfare, what might be social institutions. Certainly her life affects mass destiny, perhaps more than anyone else if she, as a broadcast journalist, had the most watched interview in history. I mean, I'd say that. So Pluto in the 10th house.
Mm-hmm.
But who knows? This may be somebody who actually finds it annoying to have to go to society balls and or, charitable fundraisers. That's my suspicion. But again, not knowing her biography, I can't say for sure.
Or would it be the people that would bother her? I mean, the
Rather
type
than
of
the
people, rather than
oysters on the half shell, or
right.
yeah, it could be. It could be
But
being
and
annoying.
in Leo,
and,
kind of the ostentation.
right, the glamour crowd.
The glamour
you know,
crowd, yeah.
Who's wearing what and why.
Right.
Yeah, those things you could probably find annoying or standing in the way of the real work to be done, which might be some, larger communal good, which the Pluto would represent. And here again, part of astrology is working your imagination. You have to, using a combination of keywords for planets, houses, signs, and aspects, you make these things up. And if you're good, your clients will tell you that. How did you know that? Another one. Here we have a semi-square between Neptune and Pluto. Well, aspects between Uranus and Neptune and Pluto are generally generational. And the thing is, anyone born her year more than likely is going to have that aspect. So it's not something that's unique and different. But what we have to look for with these generational aspects, what gives it some uniqueness in a chart is your house positions. Where, because it's always going to be in the same sign during that generation, and it's going to be the same planets. So you have to see where this actually affects the individual uniquely in their own chart. And here, again, Venus and Neptune are conjunct. We can see that Neptune's at 2 Virgo, so we are getting a little bit closer to a more powerful semi-square. By comparison, this semi-square has 2.75 asteroids associated with it, whereas the previous Venus-Pluto semi-square had only 0.23 asteroids.
What's the maximum amount for that?
I'd have to pull out the asteroid
Like 3?
manual.
About 3?
Probably.
4?
Yeah, I never
Yeah.
memorized any of
Yeah,
that.
I didn't.
There's too many things to know about astrology to start memorizing all of the quantities for asteroids. So, here again, the same houses are involved. The 10th house of career, the 11th house of friends. Let's make up a news story about this, or a news story in the case of Barbara Walters. What type of
woman
friend?
irritates her friends.
Okay. Aspects may not only be what happens to you, it can be what you do. Your aspects can be what you perpetuate in your life, or what crimes you perpetrate upon others. So, in this case, Pluto. What are the dark sides of Pluto, which we'll talk about in about 7 weeks? Being
Coercive.
coercive, yeah, conformist, wanting others to fit in. And Neptune, what are the dark sides of Neptune? Illusions,
Fantasy. I mean, well, that's not
Fantasies.
so much negative, though.
What could happen
It's
here
unbalanced.
Could you get
is
swamped with something?
swamped.
Like filled too much with something?
Yeah, I'm not making the connections, but
Oh, okay.
So friction between the utopian urges and the universal welfare urges. Okay, let's say Neptune in the 11th house, one might have high expectations of their friends, which are not always realized. With Pluto, they may not conform. So you could have friends from either all different cultures, backgrounds, or temperaments, and it's hard to bring them together because they may not get along, or they may not all have the same set of protocol or manners to work with.
Well, with Pluto in the 10th house, you would expect that she would want to control everybody, wouldn't you? Wouldn't there be an element of that?
Yes, I think Pluto in the 10th house does like to orchestrate. As does the sun on the ascendant. There's the desire to be in control, but from behind the scenes. And guess what? Few of us are successful at controlling our friends. Let alone children, spouses, parents, or...
Right. But as you say, this is a semi-square, and it's not a big deal in her life.
No, it's an occasional irritant.
Right.
But as Zane described earlier, they can lead to neuroses. The thing about grinding irritations, it's only a problem if you spend time thinking about them.
Mm-hmm.
If you're focusing in, then it'll be annoying. All right, let's talk about Mercury through the signs. Basically, we all have Mercury in our charts, and this is our opportunity to gain in some area of self-discovery. Mercury passes through the entire zodiac in 88 days, spending approximately 2 to 6 weeks in each sign. We described that at the very beginning of tonight's class. Now, the Mercury sign, or the sign of zodiac in which Mercury falls in the birth chart, is considered to represent the mentality of the individual. The beginner's horoscope maker and reader says, when Mercury is prominent in the birth chart, it denotes one who is mentally active, capable of taking an education, of functioning on the intellectual level, and of learning new tasks readily. He is at his best where he can attain his ends by writing, talking, or travel. When prominent and afflicted, there is a tendency towards restlessness. Therefore, the individual with such a chart should, as early as possible, realize that the highest form of expression can be attained only through protracted concentration. I think I read that already. Afflicted Mercury can be repeating yourself.
We have a comment here. Renee said about Barbara Walters that her Libra is amazing and Venus in the 11th house of friends. Did the delving come up as a vocabulary for Mercury in the 12th? Barbara's son's in the 12th, and delving she did well. And somebody else said that she had secret lovers, but after many years of come before her.
You're blowing her secrets.
Your students are listening.
Actually, look, I mean, obviously, relationships intrigue you. If you look at her 7th house, and I was informed earlier that the charts on the screen are too hard to see on the computer, so definitely print out your handouts and work with the paper forms for some of this stuff. But Uranus falls in Aries in the 7th house of marriage and partnerships. Describe Uranus for me. Someone, anyone.
Different.
Erratic.
Different,
disruptive,
erratic,
unusual, eccentric.
independent, individualistic. Wherever Uranus falls in our chart, that area of our life is subject to what?
Change.
Married 3 times.
Yeah.
And what she decided, basically, is quite often people will remain in marriages for economic purposes, especially in a culture where the man oftentimes earns more than the woman. And in her case, it was clear to her that she didn't have to stay in any relationship. She didn't want to because of economic reasons. So she changed, and then there is the issue of, secret lovers.
Well, more power to her.
Chances are, considering that Mercury governs her 12th house, maybe it was her that talked about them. So.
One of your listeners says, too much temptation from all that Libra.
Yeah, let's look at it. Libra.
Can you put the chart back up so they can see it?
Actually, I'd prefer they look at their own handouts, which they printed out, hopefully, because it'll take me some time to backtrack to the chart. Everyone should have it in a paper form. Okay, this is from also Beginner Horoscope Maker and Reader. The position of a planet given zodiacal sign. Only one of there should be an is in there.
I think it's underneath.
I think it's underneath the zodiac. Is only one of the many factors that must be considered in the appraisal of character traits. Such a position does reveal certain fundamental desires of the thought cells, whose activities are largely responsible for the thoughts and behavior characteristics of that planet. But it does not reveal in what manner these desires have been given fortunate or unfortunate trends as indicated by the aspects. How much power they possess is indicated by house position and aspects, nor with what special departments of life. In other words, what he's saying is you can only get limited information by what sign your planets fall in. You have to incorporate aspects in house position to have a really clear reading. But sometimes you don't have that. You may have an unknown time of birth, and you have to pull your astrological information just based on looking at an ephemeris and telling someone about planets and signs. That is indeed a challenge. So, what about Mercury in the sign of Aries? Here you have intellect expressing through a very fleet sign, a cardinal sign, and a fire sign. What Benjamin said was, with the intellectual thought cells expressing from the I am attitude, the speech should be interesting and clever, rather than impulsive and antagonistic. Anyone with Mercury in Aries?
I think I do. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Quick check.
All right.
Sure, maybe not. Oh yeah. Well, yeah, I have.
Okay.
And people take me the wrong way sometimes, you know. I guess I'm trying to be kind of witty or something, and then they take it.
They think you're insulting. At least you thought it was funny. Someone has to get the joke. All right. What about Mercury and Taurus? This is a real interesting.
That would be tough.
Yeah, Mercury and Taurus is tough.
It's very slow, methodical.
Taurus is a fixed sign.
Yeah.
So, yes, it can be slow, methodical. The intonation can be a flat line. You know, not a lot of variance.
But pleasant.
If you say. With the intellectual thought cells expressing from the I have attitude, the speech should be practical and refined rather than too determined and unyielding. Yeah, Mercury and Taurus, when they want something,
They'll hammer.
yeah. And why is that? In terms of essential dignities, Mercury is at his inharmony in the sign of Taurus. His position here can be mentally obsessive and unyielding. It can be hard when Mercury's in Taurus to walk someone through procedures of any kind.
Yeah.
Because what might seem simple to you may not be to them. There becomes some degree of complexity based on how they think something should work and the actual way in which it works. Mercury in Gemini. This is a key position. You have the intellectual thought cells expressing from the I think attitude. The speech should be based on valuable information rather than merely loquacious. There's that great word again. And that's approximate because remember Mercury goes retrograde 3 times during the year. So depending when you're born, or if Mercury changes station shortly after birth, then it can take much longer.
So mine was in 26 degrees Gemini, retrograde.
At birth?
No, it progressed.
Progressed.
On July last year, so I've got a year or so to go.
Yeah.
Phew, no wonder that's a problem I wasn't aware of.
In fact, it should tell you how quickly it moves.
It does down here.
Oh, okay.
My progressed motion along here, it tells you how.
So, the intellectual urges express through the sign of I think. There is a compatibility here. It's a fascinating arrangement, the Zodiac, and which comes to us from the Near Eastern cultures. Primarily, this arrangement came out of the sort of the Syrian, Sumerian, Babylonian cultures. Here, on the summer months, you have the sign ruled by the moon and sun. So these two signs, Cancer and Leo, stand as the king and queen of the court. What happens is they are flanked by the planet closest to the sun. Mercury is on either side, being at home in both Gemini and Virgo. They form a court in the heavens, basically, and there is a very distinct pattern here. Then Venus comes next. So after that comes Taurus and Libra, with Venus on either side of the Mercury signs. After that is going to be Mars, next in line, moving out. So here you have Aries and Scorpio. Then you have the 2 Jupiter-ruled signs, Pisces and Sagittarius, and then lastly, flanking them on either side of this court, you have Saturn-ruled signs, which are Capricorn and Aquarius. This impacted the names of our days, which are slightly off from this pattern. But we have Sunday and Moon Day. And then what happens? We know that the sun has no alchemical antidote, but the antidote to the moon is Mars. So you have Martes, or Mars Day, following Lunis, or the Moon Day. Then we move to the planet Mercury, which is Wednesday, which we were talking about tonight. The natural antidote to Mercury is Jupiter, so the next day is the Jupiter day. After that, we have Venus, which is Friday, and the natural antidote to Venus is Saturday. So there's some very sort of interesting patterns that were created so long in the past with this particular study. Mercury in Leo. With the intellectual thought cells expressing from the I will attitude, the speech should be idealistic and sympathetic rather than dominating. Not the best place. Reason for this is that Mercury's at his fall in the sign of Leo. And oftentimes Mercury in Leo sounds more like commands than requests.
At least to fixed thinking too. I have Mercury in Leo, and it's really sometimes you get into these fixed patterns. It takes a while to break out of them, but it's possible to do that.
Yes. One can be flexible whether they like it or not. Virgo. With the intellectual thought cells expressing from the I analyze attitude, The speech should be persuasive and constructive rather than sharp and critical. Please. Nevertheless, Mercury is at home in the sign of Virgo, and his analytical nature finds compatible expression here. He's able to be rational and to analyze and evaluate and think critically in that sign. Mercury in Libra. With the intellectual thought cells expressing from the I balance attitude, the speech should be just and refined rather than merely agreeing with the views of present company. Mercury in Libra wants to get along. And if we think about that, going back to the chart we studied tonight of Barbara Walters, in most of her interviews, oftentimes she's seen there doing what? Nodding her head in agreement as they speak. But that was also one of her ploys to pull information out of them.
Disarms them.
Mercury in Scorpio. Good place for Mercury. With the intellectual thought cells expressing from the I desire attitude, the speech should be scientific and helpful rather than caustic and stinging. What led him to say that?
I can't imagine.
Nevertheless, Mercury is at his harmony in the sign of Scorpio. This is where Mercury's mental processes are very profound. They're very deep thinking and very retentive. People with Mercury and Scorpio remember things. It's sort of the elephant aspect. They don't forget, which can be good or bad if they're keeping a scorecard.
It could lead to depression or something, couldn't it?
It could if there's other factors, but naturally, Scorpio is a bed Mercury likes to sleep in because it's his harmony.
Yeah.
However, Sagittarius is not. With the intellectual thought cells expressing from the I see attitude, the speech should be generous and loyal rather than impulsive and blunt. I resemble that remark. Mercury is at his detriment in the sign of Sagittarius, where his communications can be blunt or tactless. In Capricorn, with the intellectual thought cells expressing from the I use attitude, the speech should be tactful and diplomatic rather than self-seeking and deceitful. With the intellectual thought cells expressing from the I know attitude, the speech should be informative and educational rather than argumentative. But
I was going to say, but it's exalted there too, isn't it?
it is. It's interesting.
Yeah.
Mercury is indeed exalted in Aquarius. And Mercury in Aquarius can excel in knowledge. Yes, Barbara, question?
This is Christopher. Could you say something about when our Mercury shares our sun sign, and does it naturally strengthen both planets?
Yes. It does. And there are, some astrologers say, Mercury too close to the sun is combust, and that it actually negates the value of Mercury, but Zane has never found that to be true. And it actually, any conjunction stimulates both planets. Now, Mercury being in the same sign of your sun, do you think that's an unusual thing in an astrological chart?
It's probably common.
It's probably the most common thing because at the beginning of the class, I mentioned that Mercury is never more than how far away? Anyone remember?
40?
About 40,
5 or I can't remember.
what was it, 43 degrees from the sun? I'm looking for my notes here.
Well, it can only make the conjunction or the
Parallel or semi-sextile.
yeah.
No, Mercury is never more than 28.3 degrees away from the Sun. So you can only have conjunction, parallel, or sextile. So, having Mercury in the same sign as your Sun, how many in this room have that? Okay, 3 out of 4 ain't bad. That's
Well,
4 out
actually, there's more.
of 6 ain't bad. So it's not, this is not an unusual arrangement at all. All right, Mercury in Pisces. Not the best placement for Mercury. With the intellectual thought cells expressing from the I believe attitude, the speech should be positive and good-humored rather than timid or fretful. What's the worst quality of Mercury?
Gossip.
Restlessness or nervousness. And the worst quality of Pisces?
Worry.
It's quite a combo,
Yeah.
Mercury and Pisces. In fact, Mercury is at his detriment in the sign of Pisces, where he is prone to worry and anxiety. All right, we're going to speed through the next part. Planets not only fall in signs, but they also fall in houses. And from what we discussed at the beginning, I'm going to skip through this. Actually, no, I'm going back. Okay. An important concept is that a planet can rule more than one house. It rules the house in which it falls. But going back to the court that we looked at just a few minutes ago, with the Sun and Moon signs, Cancer and Leo, being flanked by Mercury signs, Gemini and Virgo, being flanked by Venus signs, being Taurus and Libra, moving out to Mars, being Aries and Scorpio, the Jupiter signs of Pisces and Sagittarius, and then the Saturn signs of Aquarius and Capricorn. These are the old rulers. When you look at a chart, you also have to look to what the house cusp positions are, because that planet will also have an impact over the house on which its home sign or signs falls. And in case you didn't understand a word of what I just said, I'm going to use an example. This, I'm not going to show it on the screen, but ask all of you to pull out your paper sample chart of Baba Wawa's chart. For example, in her chart, Mercury falls in the first house, so we'd say Mercury's the co-ruler of the first house. What would the chief ruler of the first house be? Mars, because it's the closest planet to the cusp. The cusp is the line that precedes the house. What two signs does Mercury rule as its home signs?
Gemini.
And Virgo. So we would also look to where those signs are. Gemini I can see on the cusp of the 9th house. So we'd say with Barbara's chart that Mercury also governs her 9th house of philosophies, higher expression, public opinions. And Pisces can be found on the cusp of the 6th house. Excuse me, what am I talking about?
You're talking about
The opposite sign, Virgo, can be found on the cusp of the 12th house of secret sorrows, losses, introspection, inner space, and inner exploration. So, Mercury has influence over both of those houses as well. This is more important when we move into future classes of looking at progressions, because progressions stimulate many areas of the chart. Not only where the planet is by progressed movement, where the planet was in the natal chart, but also the houses governed by that planet due to the sign on the house cusp. And sometimes under progression, you may see activity happening in one house and not another. When houses are unoccupied, then it's very important to know where the ruling planet falls, because that house then becomes subservient to the position in the chart where it falls. An example of that is the fourth house of this chart. Capricorn's on the cusp. The house is unoccupied. We look to Saturn's position being the ruler of the fourth house. Here we can see that fourth house matters of home and family are subservient to matters that govern one's neighborhood, one's neighbors, and one's personal thoughts and studies. So let's look at planets in houses. Mercury in the houses. The house in which Mercury falls in the birth chart is said to be subject to thought. The house position of Mercury strongly indicates the area of life through which the individual finds intellectual expression and mental activity. Intense mental preoccupation and restless attitudes prevail in this house. Albert Benjamin, or C.C. Zane, says, whatever house is occupied by Mercury becomes the subject of mental effort. The mind expresses itself readily where the things so denoted are concerned. The department of life ruled by the house is subject to thought. I'm repeating myself. So, in Beginner, Horoscope Maker, and Reader, what Zane says, with the intellectual thought cells expressing through the personality, there is ability for speech, writing, and study. A calling should be followed that requires brains. What chart does this apply to?
Barbara Walters.
Barbara Walters' chart. Mercury in the first house. Does anyone have Mercury in the second house? Well, if you did, with the intellectual thought cells expressing through possessions, much thought about money is shown. Reliance also on a higher power should be cultivated. This also means if you have Virgo or Gemini on the cusp of your second house, this will be part of the influence. Third house, with the intellectual thought cells expressing through education, writing, and travel are shown. Ability to express in writing and talking should be cultivated. Yes, it's good to use your words. Fourth house, with the intellectual thought cells expressing through the home, study in the home, and at the end of life are shown. To make the home a place of comfort should also be cultivated. Mercury in the fourth house, chances are that person has a library. You know, there's a book by the bed, one by the reading chair in the living room, there's one in the kitchen.
Does that describe you?
Yeah, it's not a house, it's a study. Mercury in the fifth house. With the intellectual thought cells expressing through pleasure, much thought about affectional matters is shown. Joviality should be cultivated as an aid to affectional relations. Yes, they like you when you're funny. Now, the person with Mercury in the fifth house, there is grinding concentration on their love life. They spend a lot of time thinking about that. The sixth house, with the intellectual thought cells expressing through work, thought about work, and tendency to nerve disorders are shown. To work without much nervous tension should be cultivated. Good luck. That's why they call it work. Now, if Mercury's in the 6th house, you need work that is intellectually stimulating. These are people who need to feel like they're learning something on the job, that it's not just routine. They need frequent change and the ability to exchange ideas through work. In the 7th house, Albert Benjamin says, but the Mercury thought cells expressing through partnership, marriage to a person of intellectual interest is shown. Ability to speak and write should be cultivated. What does someone want if Mercury's in their 7th house?
A partner who can communicate.
Yeah, you better like the sound of their voice. If you go blind, that's what you're stuck with. So it's important to not only like the sound of a companion's voice, but also feel like there's the opportunity for conversation there. With the intellectual thought cells expressing through inheritance, much thought about death and others' money is shown. Faith in a higher power to protect should be cultivated. Now, Mercury in the 8th house can obsess a bit on one's own demise and or what could lead up to that. So this is why the faith on a higher power is important. You know, to think and believe that what is protected. Mercury in the 9th house, with the intellectual thought cells expressing through philosophy, ability to get ideas before the public is shown. This ability should be wed to get beneficial ideas before the public.
Should be wed with something.
Yeah, exactly. Wed with what?
Yeah, I'm questioning that myself.
Would it be Jupiter? I can go look it up for you.
No, I don't see a horoscope maker and reader.
Oh, actually, there's one over here.
We're going to look up what this really should say.
There's horoscope maker.
Any comments from the peanut gallery?
It's actually, we don't have one.
Okay. All of you folks out there, also give us feedback as to how well this is coming across to you. If there's any improvements we can do, whether it's sound, whether it's images, handouts, anything. We're always interested in improving. Well, we won't wait to wed Mercury. Okay.
You want it?
No, you do it.
I'll have to look it up.
Okay, I'm going to move forward and then. Mercury in the 10th house, with the intellectual thought cells expressing through honor, a business requiring brains is shown. Faith also in a higher power to benefit should be cultivated. What you can see here is what Zane is doing with Mercury is recommending the antidote, which is Jupiter. Grinding concentration has to be antidoted with either humor or the elements of faith, which are Jupiter ruled.
9th house?
Yes.
Mercury in 9th house. Ability to get ideas before the public is shown. This ability should be used to get beneficial ideas before the public.
Used.
So what do we leave out?
Wed, used instead of wed.
Oh. Your spell corrector did something unusual.
I just cut and pasted from the
Oh.
documents in PDF file.
Oh, okay. Well, then the spell corrector. or the
When is an
the
actual
yeah.
wood? So a person with Mercury in the 10th house thinks a great deal about their career, and they need work, they need a profession that allows them to get ideas through to others. The 11th house of friendships, with the intellectual thought cells expressing through friends, friends among literary people are shown. Faith in a higher power as well as intelligence should be cultivated in the effort to realize the hopes.
You asked about to respond, and she said, I think Mercury in the 12th house lends itself to perpetuity?
Perpetuity?
P-U-P-P-E-R-Y. You do get behind the scenes, and Martha says you should be a good writer in the 9th house.
Yeah.
And so this is getting your stuff published too.
Yes, all of the above. I don't know about the puberty in the 12th house, but
You know, they're on a time delay.
okay.
No.
No, they're not.
Oh, well,
Yeah, just a little bit of a delay.
it doesn't make any difference.
So that means they already saw the 12th house before I got there. Well, that would put me on a time delay. Yeah, Mercury in the 11th house, you're going to think a lot about your friends. You're going to want friends that stimulate you mentally and intellectually, people you can communicate with. And your friends may work as agents or intermediaries for you, either connecting you with other friends or with other opportunities in life.
So that's networking.
Networking. And then the 12th house, the great mysteries. With the intellectual thought cells expressing through disappointment, much thought about sorrow and hidden enemies is shown. Faith in a higher power to remove restrictions and prevent sorrow should be cultivated. And thinking about your hidden enemies, you might actually just be paranoid. So, yes, Martha.
Alice Marie says Mercury in the 12th house feels like a retrograde.
Well, yeah, Mercury in the 12th house, unless it's in conjunction with the ascendant, has difficulty expressing itself. It's very hard to get your ideas out to others. These are people, you want to give them a fork to pry the words out of their mouth.
Is it because they're sensitive? There's a degree of sensitivity like Pisces would have, or is it?
I think it would be an unofficial similarity to Mercury in Pisces. There is a similarity. If you think of Mercury in Pisces as opposite one of its homes, it's going to be the same with Mercury in the 12th house placement. It can cause one to, at times, obsess on things. The advantage, the positive side of this, is one can be a good detective. One can explore inner space and have a lot of internal discovery. But getting one's ideas, it's great for any work where you have to do research and development and where you're working behind the scenes, analyzing information. But it's a bad position if you have to go in front of the public and share your ideas with them. You were laughing back there. Did we finally get a joke?
Yeah, the word I slaughtered was puppets.
Oh, not puberty.
And Martha said the 11th house is speaking before the masses, and Renee says that's why puppets are so rude.
Okay. So, here's your exercise for the week. We're really veering up on the end of class. We've got 2 minutes left. And I'm going to go over this with you. It's pretty much the same questions we've been asking all along, and it's self-inquiry. And you're going to write over the week, my Mercury in my chart falls in the sign of, some of the best expressions of this sign are, some of the worst expressions of this sign are. In my chart, Mercury falls in the fill-in-the-blank house. The activities ruled by this house are, describe them. Some of the ways that I perceive my intellect, mental preoccupations, and communications associated with this house are, fill in the blank. Then look at your Astrodyne report, and the relative power of my Mercury by Astrodynes is, the percentage of power is, and the relative harmony or discord of my Mercury is. The way I perceive this affecting me is, fill in the blank. The positive qualities of Mercury that I express are, and the negative qualities of Mercury I express are. And this will aid you in the process of knowing your chart more closely and in the process of inquiry. Upcoming classes next week, everybody's favorite topic, love. We're going to look where Venus falls in your chart. Any final questions before we sign off? All right, if not, look forward to seeing all of you next week.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Right. Interesting, Barbara. That was people always fascinate me. The charts are just incredible.
And, I mean, we could spend a whole class just looking at her chart and using a biography and analyzing it. I was just, in this class, just trying to focus in on the qualities of Mercury and the semi-squared, sort of narrower focus. Yes, Barb?
Did you say
Goodbye.
I did say goodbye. I can say goodbye again.
Goodbye.
Good night, all. Thank you for coming, and come back next week. And if you've not already done so, push the donate button on your so we can buy more equipment. And
thank you, it was a great class.
thank you.